So today I'm going to be discussing work that has been undertaken in my group over the past few years, where we've been exploring the use of metasurfaces, so nanophotonic structures, for enhancing optical image formation. So today I'm going to talk about basic ideas around all optical image processing. I'll then hone in on the specific approach that we're exploring and also look at how we can develop optical systems with an easily modifiable optical response. And I'll then move on to the second part of my talk, which is where we are applying these methods to various aspects of phase imaging. So we all know that images are modified in various ways. And I'm not just talking about, trying to make yourself look a bit better on social media. I'm talking about trying to undertake serious image processing operations, such as enhancing the contrast, cleaning up images to remove noise, being able to identify boundaries with an image, and also ultimately being able to identify objects in a particular field of view. So generally, in these days, these operations are performed using a computer. And the applications are quite diverse. They range from medicine through to various remote sensing applications, through to machine vision, which is becoming more and more important. Now, because these operations are performed generally, as I said, using a computer, and the amount of information that's been generated due to the wide availability of digital cameras, it's accompanied by an associated significant increase in the amount of energy being consumed in performing these operations. Furthermore, they take time to perform, even if they are actually quite quick. Collectively, this does represent a significant amount of resources required to perform these operations using a computer. Associated with this is the problem of trying to visualize transparent objects. So this, although it's probably far from clear, is a picture obtained of an unstained cheek cell. And if we look at objects like this with a conventional camera using a conventional microscopy system, there is very little contrast. However, when light passes through a transparent object, there are variations in it that produce a change in the phase of the transmitted light. Now, this phase is discarded as soon as the image is obtained with a camera. However, there are a range of optical techniques, and I'll say more about this later on, where that phase information can actually be harnessed and used to visualize and even quantify the actual phase introduced by the object itself. So as an example, one can solve the transport of intensity equation to produce an image on the right, which highlights the various features within that cell far more clearly. So again, some of the methods required to perform create images like this, they are computational or they require complex optics. So for the same reason that we want to revisit image processing more generally, it is timely to consider whether we can harness what we now know about nanophotonics to produce modified images much more efficiently and potentially quickly. To explain this in more detail, I want to go back to basic optical image processing. So if we think about light propagating through space, let me see if I can get this thing working. Why is this? This is a problem. Okay. Okay. All right. Imagine you've got some sort of optical field that carries information about an object propagating through space. And using an angular spectrum decomposition, we can consider that field as being a decomposition into plane waves traveling in different directions with respect to the optical axis. And the amplitudes of these plane waves are related to the Fourier transform of the optical field that is being decomposed. Now, the directions of these plane waves are related to the type of information that they carry. So waves that propagate at small angles with respect to the optical axis carry low spatial frequency information. So that is the broad background that lies within an optical field. On the other hand, plane waves travelling at large angles with respect to the optical axis contain fine detail about an image, such as if we look at these pictures of my lovely cat Floki here, the one on the right is an image where those edges are highlighted. So that kind of fine detail corresponds to high spatial frequencies. And there is a one-to-one correspondence between the direction these plane waves are travelling in and the transverse components of the spatial frequency of each of these plane wave components. So if we want to change an image somehow, we can do that by selectively changing the relative amplitudes and phases of these plane waves. Now, traditional all-optical image processing, which dates from, I think I've found examples going back to the 1940s, involves recognizing that a lens will bring all of these plane wave components to a focus in a given plane, the focal plane, and that means one can spatially access each of these different spatial frequency components and modify them directly with some sort of mask that has a varying transmission or phase variation. So this led to the rise of optical systems such as the well-known 4F system here, where we have a couple of lenses. We have a couple of lenses here and here, and we have an input image over here, and light from that then propagates to this plane over here. In this old diagram here is referred to as frequency plane, the spatial frequency plane, or the Fourier plane, where we can directly address the different Fourier components of the field by introducing a mask. For example, one that blocks the plane waves that correspond to low spatial frequencies, and then you can end up with an output image. I haven't reversed it here, but the idea is that you end up with an edge-enhanced image. So this is very powerful. It is effectively real time. It requires no additional energy apart from the input field. And as I'll say more about this in a minute, you can actually manipulate the phase information as well. Whereas when you collect, as I said before, collect the information with a digital camera, that phase information is lost. So these are some, it's always fun to go back and look at, some of these historic pieces of work. So if one goes back to the 1950s, this is a paper which demonstrated modifications of an optical image or an object itself by manipulating various components. I think the resulting images on the right probably don't do the original experiment justice. I think if you think back to the kinds of cameras people had then, how the work would have been reproduced in the journal article, and of course how I think the University of Melbourne have actually scanned it in and emailed it to me. I think it's very difficult to see exactly what's happened there, but particularly if you look at the top image, you can see that contrast enhancement that they were investigating. And keep in mind, this was before computers were widely available and you could do this quite easily, quite quickly digitally. One of the more famous examples, and one that is still used to this day, is Zernike phase contrast microscopy, named after Fritz Zernike, who was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1953. So he showed that by introducing phase masks into the Fourier plane, you could manipulate the phase relationship between the background and the information you were interested in and generate a significantly enhanced image of, for example, the diatom that is shown here. So this is a conventional bright field image, and this is the diatom. Okay, so what are the issues with this approach to spatial filtering? So it has a lot of positives, but the systems are quite bulky. The positioning and alignment of the filter are both critical. First, and furthermore, actually having a mask where you can independently manipulate the amplitude and phase at each given point on a mask is quite challenging using traditional approaches. And ideally, what we'd like to be able to do is to take something that looks like this and reduce it to a system that rather than having all of these separate propagation distances in here and lenses, you could reduce it down to a single layer that's of the order of 100 nanometers or so thick. And so this is where metasurfaces come in. And if we can do this, in particular, if we could just have a single optic that can do what a 4F system does, you could, for example, integrate it onto the cover slip used in a microscope to generate contrast of some unstained biological cell. A different metasurface could be designed that could be integrated directly onto the sensor chip of a camera that, again, could immediately convert the information you're interested in to intensity that can actually be accessed by a camera. So metasurfaces have attracted a huge amount of attention over the past decade or so. And the basic definition of a metasurface is some sort of two-dimensional arrangement of nanostructures. They tend to be quite thin. I've said less than 100 nanometers, but they can be a few hundred nanometers or so thick. They're generally, the design is often compatible with conventional semiconductor fabrication approaches. And over here, we've got on the right, we've got some examples of a meta lens. So rather than having a lens like this, you've got a layer of nanostructures that can do what a lens actually does. There are also devices that can, for example, also steer light, just utilizing the properties of the individual components of these structures. Now, the way a metasurface behaves when it interacts with light depend on the physical properties of the metasurface. So, you know, what are the geometries of the individual elements? How are they arranged? And the properties also going to depend on the environment. So what kind of materials is it composed of? Is there a substrate? Those sorts of things. And this is going to be important in what I'm going to be talking about later on. The behavior of the device also depends on the illumination. So it's going to depend on things like the polarization of the incident light. It's also going to depend, in some cases, on the direction of propagation of the incident wave field. So studies in meta-optics, and it's one of the basic overarching theme of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Transformative Meta-Optical Systems, of which I'm part. We're aiming to utilise light matter interactions on the nanoscale, firstly to create ultra-compact alternatives to conventional optical components, so think of a lens, but secondly, also to come up with devices that do things that you can't do with a conventional single classic optical component. And in particular, what we're interested in particular what I'm talking about here, is using them to manipulate the spatial frequency content of an optical field directly, and also for other elements that could be used for performing, determining the phase or calculating information or visualizing information about the phase of some sort of object through which light has passed. Okay, so I want to now sort of broadly divide metasurfaces, or in particular their applications, up into two categories. Firstly, local metasurfaces have attracted a lot of attention, and it's into this category that lenses fall. And in this case, we've got a local point-by-point variation in the amplitude and phase of the light that passes through them. And in the context of spatial filtering, this is a way where you could create a novel spatial filter, and indeed people have done this. So for example, here's an example. Here we have a device that this group have introduced into a 4F imaging system. And this device, for a given state of circular polarization, produces an edge-enhanced image. And but if you reverse the handedness of the incident light, you can just generate a conventional bright field image. So this is an example, and I'll come back to this, where you can actually tune the response of the metasurface without actually having to take things in and out of your optical system, but in this case, merely changing the state of polarization of the field. So the other axis of another category of metasurface that I'm going to be focusing on are those that are non-local. So these can involve coupling between individual unit cells in the metasurface. And I'll also categorize into this sort of interactions within the unit cell that also respond to, the sort of more global behavior of the incident field. I'll say more about what I mean by that. So a classic example there is a zeroth order grating. And in this case, the transmission through the device isn't point by point. It essentially depends on the spatial frequency of the incident field. So, which you recall is related to the direction of propagation of an incident plane wave. So a non-local metasurface is effectively some sort of device that has a transmission or reflection that depends on the direction of incidence of a plane wave. So rather than characterizing it in terms of a transmission function, we actually talk about its sensitivity to angle or sensitivity to spatial frequency. And that quantity is called an optical transfer function. A lot of the devices we look at have some sort of polarization dependence, in which case the relevant quantity then is a tensor. And specifically, we tend to be using one of the elements of that tensor, which in itself provides a mechanism for polarization tuning of the response. So changing the polarization, we could actually generate a different transfer function. So again, delving back into the history, and not very many people mention this when they're talking about non-local metasurfaces. I think I'm one of the few people that does, is if you go back to the late 1970s or early 1980s, there was actually demonstrations of using non-local metasurfaces rather than conventional spatial filters to perform image processing. So the first example I can find is one where a volume hologram filter was used to perform edge detection. So the actual filter and the device are basically in the same plane. Okay, so they're very close to each other. So you don't have all of those propagation distances required for conventional spatial filtering. Furthermore, there's actually a bit of flexibility about the relationship between the location of the, in this case, the filter and the object that you're trying to image. There have also been demonstrations of using simple interference filters to manipulate an incident optical field. So in this case, we have an input image, which is just a circle. The image below it is the transfer function, and the output image is shown at the bottom. So you can see that just the edges of the circular aperture are being highlighted there. So these were demonstrated for fairly early on, but then I think not that long after that, the use of computers became more widely used. They became, relatively inexpensive, and the relevant operations can be performed relatively efficiently. So I don't think anything happened with this for decades after that. But we've been sort of revisiting this concept because now we have metasurfaces, we have the computational tools, we have the nanofabrication instruments that enable us to produce devices that can perform more complex operations. Thinking back just about thin film approaches, one of the earliest, more recent approaches to non-local image processing was performed just by looking at the excitation of surface plasmon polaritons on a thin metallic film. This is a phenomenon that's well known to have a sensitivity to angle of incidence. And this plot here is showing the transfer function of the device, basically the reflection as a function of angle of incidence here. And in this particular case, the transfer function is for small deviations from this central angle here is directly proportional to one of the components of the spatial frequency. And if you think about your Fourier analysis, if you have a transfer function that multiplies a Fourier transform by kx, that actually corresponds to full first order spatial differentiation with respect to x in the image plane itself. So they were able to show that the reflected light was essentially the derivative of the input light. And when they projected both an amplitude or a phase object onto this film, the reflected field was edge enhanced, which is exactly what you'd expect with this kind of operation. We've also looked at a thin film device. This is colloquially known as a Salisbury screen. It's basically a mirror with a thin layer of dielectric and a very thin layer of a absorber on top, in this case gold. This work was led by Lucas Weizmann, who was in my group and whom some of you know. So when he projected this number 2 onto the surface at the operational wavelength, the resonant wavelength of this device, it produces an edge-enhanced image. We also looked at phase objects, and I'll talk more about phase later on, but he looked at a microlens array immersed in an index-matching fluid. Bright field image shows very little contrast, but when we reflect that image off the device here, we can clearly see the edges of the individual lenses being highlighted there. We've also looked at a simple off-the-shelf notch filter. This is largely as a proof of concept. And it's well known that if you have one of these filters, that the filtering property of the device actually is dependent on the angle of incidence. So if you look at the transmission through this device as a function of both, I might just turn, no, I don't want to do that. Oh, okay. All right, if you want to look at the transmission as a function of both wavelength and angle of incidence, you can see you've got this band stop here, but then it blue shifts as you increase the angle of incidence. So if you look at the operational wavelength here, and as you go to larger angles, you have this significant variation in transmission as you go to larger angles of incidence, so as the spatial frequency changes. So we're able to show that we could produce an edge-enhanced image using this particular device. And furthermore, on the theme of phase, that if we actually tilted the device, and I'll talk about tilting, what tilting actually does. If we tilt it by about 14 degrees, we're able to generate a phase contrast image of some unstained HeLa cells. So I'll say more about how that can be done or how that's done later on. So that's thin film type structures. The focus here is metasurfaces. And as I mentioned before, there's a lot of interest in meta-optics, and in particular, there's been a surge of interest in all-optical image processing using this non-local approach, harnessing the power of metasurfaces. So there have been examples, and this is just a snapshot of a few of them. If you've got an array of dielectric nanopillars at a certain wavelength, and this is at about 1.1 micrometers, you can generate an edge-enhanced image. There's also a lot of discussion about these devices performing mathematical operations. So I mentioned before differentiation. The background to the grating device that's shown over here is that if you have light incident on it, if you can actually generate the resulting output generates the second order spatial differentiation with respect to the direction normal to the grating bars there. And the other one here involves a kind of metasurface or even a photonic crystal type of structure. And again, the group of Andrea Alou were able to show that this type of device was able to produce an edge-enhanced image. I'll come back to this shortly because we've done some work building on this. So I mentioned before the power of being able to change the operation performed by the metasurface without having to take the device out and put it back in. Those of you who've done things like differential interference contrast microscopy would be aware that you know, to change the modality from bright field to phase contrast, you need to put a bunch of elements in there and fiddle around and generate your contrast there. Ideally, we'd like our metasurface to be such that we could just easily change the device itself somehow, or the illumination to change the operation performed by the metasurface. So there are a range of actuation mechanisms that people have been exploring to reconfigure the behavior of a metasurface. I'm not necessarily talking about image processing here, but in general, there is a lot of interest in being able to modify the properties of metasurfaces. And as examples, this is some work that we did in collaboration with Francesca Iacopi's group when she was at UTS. It was a proposal. We weren't able to sort of, because she left, we weren't able to sort of build on this. But essentially, it is epitaxial. We modeled epitaxial graphene on silicon carbide and showed that in the mid-IR, by changing the Fermi level, we were able to actually go from a sort of bright field modality through to an edge-enhanced image there. In terms of actual implementations, members of Jason Valentine's group showed that if we had, go back to the array of silicon nanopillars, if these were put on a flexible substrate, by stretching the substrate, modifying the coupling between the individual elements, you could change the modality from conventional bright field through to an edge-enhanced, or as they've said here, a differentiated image. More recently, in work that was led by my former student, Shaban Suleiman, and this was done in collaboration with Andrea Alou's group at CUNY, we looked at incorporating a thin layer of phase change material, vanadium dioxide, into this particular structure over here. And the idea is that the structure was designed so that at room temperature, when the VO2 is in an insulating phase, the structure was designed so that the transmitted field produced an edge-enhanced image. Now, VO2 undergoes a phase change when the temperature increases above 65 degrees Celsius. So the other part of the design was that this property disappeared once the VO2 entered the other metallic phase. So in the top left, we have scanning electron microscope images of the fabricated device. Over here, we have the transmission as a function of the wavelength. So we've got transmission spectrum through the device at different temperatures. And you can see at the lower temperatures, we have a significant peak here and a low transmission here. But as the temperature increases above the phase change, transition temperature, you can see that these resonant features disappear. If we now pick this wavelength here, which is about 1670 nanometers, and look at the transmission as a function of angle of incidence, again, you can see at the lower temperatures that we have suppressed transmission near normal incidence, and the transmission increases for larger values of the angle of incidence. As you go above as the VO2 undergoes the phase transition, however, this plot, which is effectively the transfer function, it actually flattens out. So what we would expect is at low temperatures, we would block low spatial frequencies, but at high spatial frequencies, we would just end up with a faithful reproduction of the transmitted field. This is a simple schematic showing the experimental setup here. Note that the target object and the metasurface itself are located quite close together. In the absence of any metasurface, this is what the transmitted image looks like. So it's just the CUNY logo. When the metasurface was introduced into the system, you can clearly see the resulting image is edge enhanced. And this is the resulting image when the temperature is increased. And you can see that you go from this edge enhanced image as you go above the phase transition temperature, you end up producing a conventional bright field image, which is a faithful replica of the incident field itself. So this is a nice proof of concept of what one can do with metasurfaces without actually having to physically put things into and out of the system. And there's a lot of interest in other methods for actually modifying the resulting image. Okay, so I want to spend the rest of this talk discussing the application of non-local metasurfaces to phase imaging. So many of you would be very familiar with the challenge of being able to obtain information about transparent objects. So here we have an image, conventional bright field image of a cheek cell, and also an image, side-on view of an optical fiber that's surrounded by an index matching fluid. There's very little contrast there. The resulting images are quite information poor. So as I mentioned previously, what happens when light passes through an object like this? There are not only variations in the amplitude of the transmitted field, but changes in the thickness and refractive index of the various components of the object also contribute to changes in the phase of the field. However, you might have an object that introduces a variation amplitude that looks like this, but the phase variation looks like this. You can clearly see there's a lot more information and contrast in this particular image here, but as soon as you grab an image of that, you obtain only the amplitude information. So there's a lot of rich information in the phase, and as a consequence, a huge number of methods have been developed for actually getting that information. And these range from qualitative approaches, including Zernike phase contrast and differential interference contrast microscopies, through to methods, quantitative methods such as interferometry. Interferometry, very powerful, very widely used, but it does require relatively complex optical components, and the sensitivity can be challenging to actually harness. There are also a number of well-known non-interferometric methods that can be used for wavefront sensing, used in astronomy and ophthalmology. And there are also other methods generally referred to as phase retrieval. There are very powerful computation-forward iterative approaches. And there are also deterministic approaches that don't require quite so much computation, but can require more complex configurations. And this includes solving the transport of intensity equation to extract the phase. And this is something that I worked on a number of years ago. Okay, so the question we're looking at here is how can we use non-local metasurfaces to either visualize or even quantify the phase. So the approaches we've been using, firstly, qualitative, we've been interested in actually being able to visualize the phase, but also we've been dipping our toe recently into deterministic phase recovery using metasurfaces. Now, one thing I wanted to say something about before I dive into this any further, and that is the role of symmetry and the benefits of deliberately introducing some asymmetry into the system. And it comes back to the fact that as soon as you obtain an image with a camera, you lose phase information. So if, for example, you've created a metasurface that has a nice transfer function that's directly proportional to kx, so remember this corresponds to differentiation. You have an input field, let's imagine it's a Gaussian, and your metasurface generates the derivative. You then obtain the resulting image with a camera. You have actually discarded information about whether the gradients in the image are positive or negative. If, however, you break the symmetry, so for example, using off-normal illumination or manipulating the polarization, it is possible to have a transfer function that actually looks more like this. And this type of transfer function actually contains more or produces more information than a simple transfer function that looks like this. So doing this enables us to resolve positive and negative phase gradients in an image. It enables us to generate pseudo 3D phase contrast images, and it also provides us ultimately with the information required to quantitatively recover the phase. From a phase point of view, these are some simulations just showing if we have some sort of phase object with a phase distribution like this, no amplitude contrast. If we had a device that had a linear response to, a direct linear response here to spatial frequency, it produces a nice edge-enhanced image. But if we introduce that offset, we obtain an image that looks a lot like a differential interference contrast image, and it contains far richer information than this image in the middle. Okay, so the various approaches, I'll run through the various approaches we've been exploring. This is some work that was led by my collaborator, Tim Davis, that I think many of you know. This involved a metasurface that consists of three gold, well, the individual elements consist of individual gold nanobars. So this is a periodic array of this trimer type of structure here. And if we look at the transmission through this structure, when the incident illumination is polarized at an angle of 45 degrees to these bars here, and there is an output analyzer that transmits light that is vertically polarized, and you look at the transmission through this structure, these experimental results show at normal incidence you would get that blue curve there. If you go off normal in one direction, you would get this green curve. But if you illuminate it symmetrically from the opposite direction, you actually end up with this maroon curve. So that's exactly what I'm talking about in terms of that asymmetry there. Furthermore, Tim did these experiments where he plotted, and this is this polarization configuration here, you plot the transmitted intensity as a function of spatial frequency, and that is effectively, angles going from negative one side of normal to the other. And you can see there is this effectively this linear response in this region here. If you rotate the input polarization by 90 degrees, you actually end up with the opposite contrast. I should say the dots here are experimental results, and the red curves are the result of a simple electrostatic model that Tim and collaborators developed. This is, down the bottom, is when we've got two orthogonal polarizers, and there is in fact a variation down here that's a little bit hard to distinguish on this scale, and up the top here it's again relatively flat. So we looked at simulations showing the transmission through a kind of phase distribution that was meant to look like a red blood cell. When we've got the cross polarizers, you can see that edge enhanced image. Okay, so you go from effectively no contrast to seeing the edges. On the other hand, when you rotate the input polarizer by 45 degrees, you can theoretically anyway generate this contrast that I was talking about before. The challenge with this particular approach, and the one that we struggled with, is the fact that the contrast is quite low. Okay, so it makes it very difficult to be able to distinguish anything amidst the sort of noise that one expects in a lot of experiments. So we've been exploring a range of other approaches, one of which, again, this was work led by Lucas Weizermann as part of his PhD. He looked at a resonant waveguide grating structure. This is well known to have a sensitivity to angle of incidence. If we look at our design wavelength, which was 635 nanometers, and we look at a backfocal plane image through the device, so here we have our spatial frequencies Kx and Ky. You can clearly see the transmission at normal incidence, which is in the middle, is very low. But as we increase Kx, we will end up with a spatial frequency varying transmission. So Lucas used the spatial light modulator to generate a phase map, and then looked at the transmitted field in the absence down the bottom and the presence in the middle there of the grating itself. And you can see incorporating the grating permitted us to be able to see the edges of the object which we could not do without the grating itself. Things became far more interesting, however, when we tilted the grating to introduce that offset, and we now get this sort of pseudo 3D phase contrast image. And furthermore, just to highlight the fact that this is a real-time phenomenon, this is the resulting image when the grating is inserted into and then removed from the optical field. So you've got this direct visualization of phase just by moving this simple element in and out of the field itself. And we extended this, we called this a nanophotonic enhanced cover slip. So it was incorporated into a microscope, and we were able to generate images that were consistent with conventional DIC results. Another device where we've been looking at phase contrast was one that was developed by Shaban Suleiman that I mentioned previously as well. And this was a polarization-tunable device. For a given polarization, we're able to see the phase. This phase is introduced by spatial light modulator, and this was an amplitude mask. So for one polarization, we could see the phase, and for the orthogonal polarization, we would end up with a pure amplitude image. And I won't go into details here. This did require tilting, again, by about 5 degrees, and Shaban was able to show that we could visualize unstained prostate cancer cells. The bright field image shows very little contrast, which obviously shows up in the DIC image, so there is phase contrast there. And again, by changing the polarization, we can switch the polarization sensitivity on and off. This is probably the last thing that I'll talk about, but we wanted to get away from tilting. Okay, we wanted to be able to introduce this kind of offset without actually tilting the device. And the approach that we went to is often referred to as optical routing. And the first demonstrations came out of Federico Capasso's group. I think Zhao Lin, who used to work with me, worked on this, where they have this patterned surface, and you could actually excite surface plasmons in different direction by changing the handedness of the incident circularly polarized light. More recently, this work called Our Eye, it wasn't aimed at imaging, but what it does feature are these, again, it's an optical routing effect, but here we have these orthogonal metallic nanoparticles sitting on a wave guiding layer here. This work was theoretical. And the way this works is that if you've got circularly polarized light illuminating this structure, because the rods are orthogonal, they are excited 90 degrees out of phase with each other. They are also spatially separated, which introduces another 90-degree phase shift into the light that's ultimately coupled into that high refractive index wave guiding layer. So this paper was primarily aimed at presenting a computational model. So they actually showed the transmission through this structure for right and left circularly polarized light. This white dashed line here is normal incidence. Over here, we've got the photon energy over here, but you can clearly see that we've got this asymmetry about normal incidence that we were interested in being able to utilize. So if we model this device, we came up with some specifications that worked for our particular application. If we look at the normal incidence transmission and look at that particular resonance there, and this is our modulation transfer function. The phase transfer function is not very interesting, so it's fairly flat, but it is something we've looked at. Normal incidence is in the middle, and you can clearly see you've got very little sensitivity to KY, and you've got this, sort of linear sensitivity to KX. So simulated, if we have an input phase that looks like that, we would expect an output intensity that looks so it should generate phase contrast. So this is a scanning electron microscope image of the device that Lucas fabricated. Here we have the transmission as a function of KX, so one of the spatial frequency components. And you can clearly see, firstly, that we have this asymmetry about KX equals 0. And we also have a flip in the contrast as we go from left to right hand circularly polarized light. Lucas again looked at a spatial light, a phase produced by a spatial light modulator. And here we have on the right the images obtained without the presence of the metasurface. So that's over here. And here is what is seen in the presence of the metasurface. So firstly, we can enhance the contrast. It's got this kind of relief appearance to it. And furthermore, the contrast is flipped when you change the handedness of the incident light. Okay, so exploring this, what we could do with this handedness flip in more detail. Imagine you've got a pure phase object. So for example, you've got light going through some, transparent microsphere that produces a phase that looks like this. So mathematically, the phase is going to take that form, or the field, the transmitted field is going to look like that. Imagine you've got a metasurface with a linear transfer function, so a constant plus some term that varies as kx, and then you look at the resulting intensity. If we then go and look at the intensity emerging in the case where we don't have that offset term, so A is equal to 0, we end up with that image on the right. So as I mentioned before, we've lost information about the sign of the gradient. If we introduce that offset, we get this image, and I've shown you a couple of examples like this already. Okay, now imagine that you are somehow able to flip the contrast, okay, which I've just been talking about there. So we get two images somehow, and they've got that reverse contrast. So you get two images that look like that. This is what the intensities look like. And if you go and subtract those two intensities, a lot of pesky higher order terms disappear, and you end up with a differential phase contrast image that is directly proportional to the phase gradient. So that is a very important step in being able to quantify the resulting phase. So my current student, Hai-Wei Wang, has been investigating doing this. And in particular, he's gone back to this basic structure that Lucas explored. We are able at one particular wavelength to generate, rather than just having a contrast that's sensitive to kx. At one wavelength, we have a contrast that depends on kx. At another wavelength, we have contrast that depends on ky. So we can generate two differential phase contrast images, and that is sufficient information to be able to recover the phase. Okay, so we obtain two images at each wavelength. We're using a quarter wave plate and a polarization sensitive camera. So those two images at each wavelength are obtained simultaneously on with a single image, so single shot. We can construct at each wavelength these differential phase contrast images. We take that Fourier transform, and with knowledge of the transfer function, we are able to recover the phase using this simple expression here and the introduction of a regularization parameter. I'm running out of time to go into too much detail here, but this is an image of the structure that Hai-Wei fabricated. Up the top, we have our simulated transfer functions at the two wavelengths and for right and left circularly polarized light. And the wavelengths are slightly different for the fabricated device due to various things, but we have similar behavior in the experimental device. So Hai-Wei investigated this device. They again used a spatial light modulator, which necessitated this very complicated looking optical system, which is not where we envisage this ultimately going. But this is the target phase. Here we have the two differential phase contrast images. You can clearly see that the top one is related to horizontal gradients because you lose that information about vertical contrast through there. So we've got these two images here. We can also construct a bright field image, and you can see the information there is poor. And this is the recovered phase. So we end up with a quite good agreement with the target phase. And that includes with these line plots here. We note that the agreement deteriorates slightly as the spatial frequency increases. These are some images of unstained HeLa cells. These are the two differential phase contrast images. This is a reconstructed phase. This is a differential interference contrast image that's been synthesized from this information. And this is a real DIC image. First thing you might note, depending on how well this is reproduced, is our spatial resolution is not what you get with a DIC microscope. That's because the numerical aperture of our device is relatively low. So looking at HeLa cells is probably not what this device is best at doing, but it is an interesting demonstration of a biological application. So I've run out of time here, but suffice to say we have been working on using these inverse design structures as well, and that's being led by another student of mine, Lincoln Clark. Okay, so basically I've been talking about what we call object plane spatial frequency filtering or image plane, rather than this kind of 4F type of systems. It is an all-optical approach. We don't need any extra energy. We can, in the context of phase, generate phase contrast or quantitative phase images. And the ability to reconfigure the device enables us to generate multiple operations using a single metasurface, and also ultimately to be able to quantify the phase. The applications generally lie in the space where one wants very compact and, further down the track, relatively inexpensive optical devices. So I'll stop there, but I will like to acknowledge everyone who has contributed to this work. Thank you.
For the beautiful talk, as always, so many beautiful examples for the Metasurface-based imaging processing. Before we proceed for the questions, can I ask someone knows what happens once this, because I just realized it's counting down the time. Will immediately cut off this projection or? Anyways.
We're on borrowed time.
As a reminder, after this, I think Aaron has nicely offered some kind of afternoon tea on the case, whatever, so that we can also enjoy some of our time this end. Any questions? Yes, please.
Thank you for your talk. That was really cool. I noticed that for a lot of your examples, you put the metasurface as close to the object plane as possible. But there were some examples where they had it closer to the image plane.
Yes.
And I've seen people put it like close to the lens plane. What are the considerations there for where you want to put the metasurface?
Okay, so one of the things about re-imaging the object is we can change the distribution of spatial frequencies, but also one of the challenges of putting the object and the metasurface very close together is that you can't put them right against each other unless the cover slip example is that's not the case there. But if you've got two objects and they're near each other, we've tended to make our metasurfaces with sizes of the order of 250 to 300 micrometers, just because it takes a while to produce them, as you would know. And that actually produces some scattering from the edges. So what I think the way we express it now is it significantly reduces the field of view. So I think some of our examples, you start off with a 250 micrometer size metasurface, and you put your two objects together and you end up with an effective field of view of less than 100 microns. So that is something that could be rectified by just making bigger metasurfaces. The other thing with the spatial light modulator, we do actually need to re-image it to be able to basically just get at the distribution. So that's a trade-off that we make, because we want to be able to use the spatial light modulator is a really nice tool, but we need to re-image it to actually access the phase. Yeah, does that answer your question?
So it's more practically about how big the metasurface is rather than a performance.
It's not inherent to the use of the device. So we can either access the image plane. As I said, I mean, if we had a great big metasurface, that last device I was talking about would probably be quite nice sitting on top of a camera chip, and the resolution issue would not be such a problem. So, yeah.
So the way you do the differentiation doesn't really change.
No, you end up with effectively the same, similar operation. Yeah. Yeah. So we haven't been terminated, or maybe the online people have gone.
So much for your talk. I was wondering if maybe, if it's in principle possible to create something like mathematical processing pairs of images, making operations on pairs. For example, convolve one image with another, or multiply, for example, or something like that.
Yeah, so there is a lot of interest in being able to perform more sophisticated operations. Some of the, if you start introducing nonlinear optical properties, for example, that significantly increases the range of operations you can actually perform. And also having multiple metasurfaces, again, you're starting to get into that kind of what's referred to as neuromorphic computing types of approaches. So, I mean, there's a huge number of different things you can actually do with metasurfaces once you start fiddling around, you start manipulating the light in various ways.